Welcome to the Bedtime Sleepy Historian, where history drifts as slowly as a monastery bell. Tonight, we step into a world before clocks, when monks measured time by the rising sun, the turning stars, and the echo of a bell across stone cloisters. These are not stories of war and noise, but of rhythm, silence, and the strange beauty of forgotten lives. If you find comfort in these gentle journeys, support the channel. Like this video, subscribe for more sleepy history, and let me know in the comments where in the world you are listening from. Together, we keep the quiet past alive. The bell before the bell. Time, to a medieval monk, was not measured by the tick of gears or the hands of a dial. It was measured by rhythm. Before mechanical clocks, before towers with iron bells marked the hours across a valley, monasteries moved in step with subtler instruments: the sun, the stars, the chant, and above all, the ear. Imagine a cloister in the 11th century. Its stone walls rise gray and damp with moss. Inside, the monks move not hurriedly, but with a steady current, as though carried by something invisible. The bell has not yet tolled. The invention of complex clockworks was still distant in some towns, unheard of in others. Yet the community did not stumble in disorder. Brother Anselm, thin as a reed and forever squinting at the horizon, was known as the timekeeper. He had no device save his own senses. At dawn, he would note the soft paling of the sky, the fading of the morning star. His task was to rouse the community for matins, the first office of the day. Some mornings he awoke before light, padding silently across the stones, listening for the faint call of a bird that only sang at the cusp of dawn. When its note broke the silence, he knew it was time. In other hours, monks marked the sun's angle against the courtyard columns. Shadows stretched like long, obedient fingers, pointing out the hour without fail. In winter, the cold bite of air was itself a measure. Prayers had to be shortened or lengthened to match the frost or thaw, the season itself becoming a clock. Yet the secret was not in the sky alone. The rule of Saint Benedict taught that prayer, labor, and study must weave together like strands of rope. If the sun was veiled in clouds, if stars were hidden, monks kept time by memory, by the rhythm of psalms recited so often that the body itself became a sundial. One psalm led to the next, one office to the next. Even the stomach served as a reminder. Hunger marked the hour of a meal as clearly as a brass bell. Brother Anselm once told a novice, "Time does not live in the sky. It lives in us. It is the pattern we stitch in our days. The sun only reminds us not to forget." And so, in silence, in chant, in the bending of shadows, a monastery kept perfect time, without ever owning a clock. The sundial carved in stone. In some monasteries, the rhythm of the sky was carved into the very walls. A visitor might not notice it at first, just a simple semicircle, scratched or chiseled into stone near the cloister door. But to the monks, it was as useful as a library. This was the mass dial, sometimes called a scratch dial. A hole drilled at the center once held a short rod or even a piece of wood. As the sun moved, its shadow stretched across the markings, telling not the precise minute, but the sacred divisions of the day. Prime, terce, sext, none, vespers. Brother Godric, who tended the garden, often glanced at it when he returned with herbs clinging to his sleeves. He could tell at a glance whether it was time for sext, the midday prayers, or if he still had an hour to weed among the cabbages. It was not an exact science, yet it was enough. But what of cloudy days? What of winter, when the sun lingered low and its light was swallowed by the horizon before supper was taken? Here, the monks relied on their own bodies once again. An old abbot taught that a candle could become a clock. A tall wax taper, measured carefully with notches, could be lit, and as it burned, each melted segment marked an hour. But wax was costly, and candles were rationed like treasure. A monastery could not afford to waste them simply to mark time. So most of the time, monks listened. They listened to the bells of neighboring parishes, if the wind carried them. They listened to the natural chorus of the day, the rooster, the owl, the workers in the fields, the hush of evening when the last carts rumbled down the village road. Brother Godric once laughed when a novice asked how he knew it was none. "Because my back told me," he said, wiping dirt from his hands. "After 3 hours of stooping, it always tells me." Time was not so much measured as felt. And in the monastery, where every act repeated day after day, prayers, work, silence, the monks did not feel robbed by imprecision. Instead, they felt anchored. The world outside spun in its own chaos, but within the cloister, the flow of time was steady, gentle, and sure. The human bell. Not every monastery had a fine bronze bell to command the hours. In poorer houses, a wooden clapper, a hand gong, or even a shouted voice sufficed. Brother Anselm, who often served as timekeeper, carried a staff with an iron ring fixed at the top. At the appointed hours, he would walk the corridors, striking the ring against stone, the hollow clang echoing through the cloister. To the monks sleeping in their narrow cells, it was as sharp as thunder. To those at work, it was a reminder: put aside your tool, your quill, your spade, and prepare your soul. Some monasteries used what was called a watch system. Certain brothers were assigned to stay awake through the night, keeping vigil in turns. Their duty was not only prayer but also vigilance over time itself. When the hour came for matins or lauds, they would move quietly through the dormitory, shaking shoulders and whispering, "Benedicamus Domino, let us bless the Lord." The rhythm was so deep in their lives that even without watches, many monks awoke naturally, as though the very pulse of the monastery had entered their bones. Novices often struggled, sleeping through calls, stumbling half-dreaming to the choir stalls. But the older brothers? They rose almost before the summons came, their bodies trained by decades of repetition. One winter's night, when the snow pressed heavy on the roof and no light pierced the black sky, Brother Anselm told the novices a tale. "Once," he said, "before I took vows, I was a shepherd. I learned to wake when my sheep stirred, even before wolves came. A man can tie his breath to the rhythm of another creature, to the land itself. Here in the cloister, we tie our breath to God's rhythm. That is why, even without sun or clock, we rise when it is time. Time is a covenant." The novices listened, some nodding in wonder, others struggling to keep their eyes open. And when the call for matins finally came, they followed Anselm into the chapel, yawning, shivering, but slowly learning what he meant, that even a man's body could become a bell, a keeper of hours, if trained by devotion. The hourglass of sand and silence. Not all monasteries had the same tools. In wealthier abbeys, tucked inside libraries where parchment and ink were as precious as relics, one might find an hourglass, 2 glass bulbs sealed together, sand whispering from one to the other. Brother Matthew, a scribe with eyes worn thin from candlelight, kept such an hourglass by his desk. It was not large, nor precise in the way later clockmakers would demand, but it was faithful. Each turn of the glass gave him the measure of his labor. Copy this psalm before the sand runs out, sharpen your quill when it does, pause to stretch your hand. He often said the hourglass did not count time so much as invite rest. Without it, a man might write until his fingers cramped and his letters turned crooked. With it, he could measure not only his duty to the text but also his duty to his own flesh. But the hourglass was also fragile. More than once, Matthew had watched a novice knock one from the desk, and the delicate bulbs would shatter, the sand spilling like lost hours across the floor. "A reminder," he would sigh, "that all time ends in silence." Other brothers distrusted such devices. Brother Alfric, the gardener, muttered that sand could no more keep God's time than a rooster's crow could summon dawn. To him, time was written in the earth, when frost hardened the soil, when leaves fell, when the bees quieted. The glass, he thought, was only a trick, a plaything for men too fond of order. Yet even Alfric admitted that sometimes, when the fog lay heavy, and the sun was a pale blur, the hourglass was the only thing that kept the monks from losing track of sext or none. It gave structure when the heavens were hidden. And so it was that time in the monastery was never a single device, never a single voice. It was a weave of many strands, bells, shadows, sand, stars, memory, and prayer. Each monk found his way of marking it, and together, their many rhythms became one harmony. The night sky as a clock. When no bell tolled and no sand slipped, the stars themselves spoke. On clear nights, monks looked upward to read the heavens. The monastic roof beams were notched with gaps, where one could peer out and fix eyes on constellations. To Brother Hugo, the night watchman, Orion was not a hunter but a herald. When his belt reached a certain tilt above the treetops, it was time for matins. When the bright star Aldebaran glimmered over the eastern ridge, it marked the slow drift toward Lauds. The brothers did not map the skies with the precision of later astronomers, yet they learned to know them intimately. Winter's sky told a different rhythm from summer's, and clouds forced them into guesswork. Some abbeys even carved star charts into wood, a monk's hand tracing the path of constellations across the seasons, pairing them with the hours of prayer. Hugo liked to say that stars were God's lamps, hung above so the world could not forget its creator. Every one of them, he whispered once to a young novice struggling to stay awake, is a bead upon the rosary of heaven. And every time you pray, you move with their shining. On storm-tossed nights, when clouds smothered the sky, the watchmen strained their ears instead. The silence of the world carried its own clues. The last crow of the rooster, the change in the wind, the slow dying of the embers in the hearth. Time was written not only in light but in sound, in absence, in decay. And so, by watching the sky, or listening when the sky was hidden, the monks wove their way through the dark hours. They became, in a sense, astronomers of devotion, reading not only the constellations but the great fabric of God's order, patient and exact. It was said in one abbey that a brother who truly knew the stars never lost his place in the Psalter. Even if stripped of bells, sand, or even words, he would still find the hours simply by gazing up and listening for the silence between the winds. The water clocks of the cloister. Before gears and pendulums found their way into towers, there was water. In certain monasteries, especially those with access to skilled craftsmen, the brothers relied upon clepsydry, water clocks. A vessel of stone or bronze, fitted with a tiny hole, allowed liquid to drip steadily from one chamber into another. The slow, patient fall of each droplet measured the unseen passage of time. Brother Odo, the cellarer, oversaw one such device in his abbey. Each evening he filled the vessel, and by dawn its water would have sunk to a marked level, telling him how many hours had passed. He treated the clock as though it were another monk. It had to be fed, tended, and respected. "Leave it too long unfilled," he warned novices, "and your prayers will wander into darkness." The water clock was never perfect. In winter, the chill thickened the flow, slowing the droplets. In summer, warmth quickened them. Yet the monks knew these flaws and adjusted with patience. After all, no clock was flawless. The bell could be late, the rooster could crow too soon, the sun could hide. Time itself, they thought, was more flexible than men often assumed. There was a kind of poetry in the water clock's rhythm. Each drop echoed in the still cloister at night, a sound both humble and eternal. Some said it reminded them of the heart, steady, mortal, yet tethered to something greater. Others compared it to Christ's blood, poured out drop by drop, a sacrifice that counted the hours of salvation. And sometimes, when the brothers gathered for vigils, the steady drip was all that kept them awake. It was not only a measure of time but a meditation, an anchor for drifting minds. To live by water was to live by surrender, accepting that the stream might falter, that the vessel might crack, that one must refill it every day. The monks embraced this, for their whole life was built on such surrender. Just as a psalm never lasted forever, only for its verse, so too did the water clock remind them that every moment was borrowed, measured, flowing away. Candles that counted the hours. When water froze in its jars and stars hid behind winter fog, the monks turned to fire. Candles were not only a source of light, they were rulers of time. A wax taper carefully measured could burn for a known span, an hour, perhaps two, if made by steady hands. In some abbeys, brothers etched lines along the shaft, small notches that disappeared as the wax melted. Each notch marked an interval, a silent bell rung by flame. Brother Athelred was keeper of the tapers in one northern cloister. He claimed that wax was as true a servant of God as stone or water. "See," he would murmur, tilting a lit candle so that its shadow danced along the cloister wall. "How it gives itself away for the sake of others! As it vanishes, time is revealed." To the novices, it was a strange comfort, that something so small and flickering could stand against the vastness of the night. Of course, candles lied as easily as they told the truth. A draught in the chapel could hasten the flame. Impure wax burned unevenly, turning 1 hour into half. More than one brother fell asleep at his desk when a candle sputtered out too soon, and was woken sharply at dawn by the abbot's stern look. Still, the ritual of measuring time by flame became second nature. When the bell-ringer doubted the hour, he would slip a glance at the taper beside him. If it had burned to the 3rd notch, matins was upon them. If to the 5th, the first hints of dawn were near. Some monasteries even kept candle clocks, great pillars of wax embedded with nails. As the candle melted, the nails dropped one by one into a metal basin, clattering with a sound that carried down the halls. To a drowsy brother fighting sleep, that sudden clang was more startling than any bell. And so, fire became a tutor of time, unstable, yes, but luminous. For monks, who sought to live as lamps themselves, burning steadily before God, the candle was more than an instrument. It was a mirror. Shadows on the stone. When the sun returned, shadows became the truest clock of all. Every monastery had its quiet corners where sunlight traced dependable paths. Cloisters with wide courtyards, refectories with narrow windows, towers that caught dawn on one side and dusk on the other, all became instruments of time. The monks did not need ornate dials at first. They knew that when the light touched the 3rd paving stone, terce was near. When it struck the carved arch of the chapter house, none was close. In some abbeys, the walls themselves bore faint markings, etched by patient hands. Brother Oswald, a quiet scholar of Durham, was said to have spent 3 summers scratching lines along a cloister column, noting how each season bent the shadow differently. The marks grew into a rough sundial, one that guided the ringing of bells long after his bones rested beneath the floor. Yet shadows were fickle companions. Clouds thickened, storms swallowed the sky, and in winter the sun sometimes refused to climb above the horizon. On such days the monks did not curse the loss of light. They simply turned inward. The hour was guessed from habit, the prayers recited as if the sun had agreed with them, even if it had not. In this way, faith filled the gaps where instruments faltered. The interplay of shadow and stone became part of their spiritual imagination. Some saw the cloister sundial as a sermon. All things moved, all things changed, all things leaned away from the light until evening came. Others whispered that each shadow was a reminder of mortality, cast by the fleeting body that stood in its way. And so the monks measured their days by shadows, knowing well that darkness always followed, but also that it always returned to light. The body as a clock. Even without bells, water, or shadow, the monks carried time within themselves. A life of discipline tuned the body into a metronome. Steps measured along the cloister walk became steady as the toll of iron. Breaths drawn during silent vigils fell into rhythms so precise that an elder monk could sense when an hour had passed simply by the rise and fall of his chest. Brother Cuthbert, an aged monk of Lindisfarne, was known for this uncanny gift. In the silence of night watches, when clouds smothered moon and stars, he would whisper, "The hour is nearly come." And often, before a novice could doubt him, the bell would stir on the tower. No water clock, no taper, no sundial, just a body so shaped by ritual that time itself seemed to live in his pulse. The rule of Saint Benedict, repeated daily, reinforced this sense of rhythm. Meals at fixed hours, psalms counted in strict numbers, steps retraced from chapel to dormitory, all made the body remember what the sky sometimes forgot. Hunger announced sext. Weariness tugged at vespers. The aching knees of a penitent told him that the midnight office had stretched long. It was not only the monks themselves. The very animals of the monastery seemed bound to this invisible rhythm. The roosters crowed not merely at dawn, but at the very moments prayers shifted. Dogs stirred before the bell. Even bees in their hives buzzed more fiercely when lauds approached, as though creation itself conspired to keep the monks aligned with eternity. Thus the body was not an unreliable instrument. It was a living clock, taught by habit, sharpened by devotion. And in its quiet beat, the monks learned to see time not as something outside of them, but as something dwelling deep within. The gathering of methods. In time, the monasteries wove all their measures of time into one great fabric. No single method was enough, for each could fail. Shadows disappeared in storms. Candles guttered in draughts. Water clocks froze in winter or ran dry in drought. Even the heartbeat of an old monk might falter. So abbots, with the practicality of shepherds, gathered them together. Bells were set by the sun when it was clear, by the dripping of water when it was dark, and by the inner sense of the brethren when storms raged. The monastic day became a braid of all these threads, so tightly woven that even when one strand snapped, the whole cloth held. It was in these experiments that monasteries became nurseries of invention. A monk who once only scratched marks upon a column began to carve them into calibrated arcs. Another, frustrated by uneven water clocks, tinkered with gears and weights. Slowly, almost without realizing, they began to step into the realm of mechanical time. At Salisbury, chroniclers wrote of a wheel that turned as water dripped, striking a small clapper against a bell. At Milan, a monk built a sundial on the tower so large that villagers beyond the cloister could see its shadow move like the hand of a giant. And yet, the monks themselves never saw these contrivances as marvels. To them, time was not machinery, it was prayer. The tools were merely aids to keep their souls in step with eternity. When a new device rang more accurately, they did not boast of invention. They simply bowed their heads and gave thanks that the hours of God could now be kept with greater care. Unknowingly, though, they were building the future. For what began as scratched stones and dripping jars would, in centuries to come, become the ticking heart of every town square, every pocket, every household, a world taught to live by the clock, just as the monks once did by bells. When the village learned the hours. At first, the hours belonged only to the monastery. The villagers outside the walls rose with the sun, worked until hunger gnawed, and rested when darkness fell. Their days followed the turn of seasons rather than the toll of bells. But gradually, the sound of the cloister's rhythm seeped into their lives. The monastery bell rang at prime, and the shepherd on the hill paused, leaning on his staff, though he knew not the psalm being sung. At sext, the baker in the village lifted his flour-dusted head and muttered, "They're at it again," before pushing his bread into the oven. Children learned to measure their play not by shadows, but by bells. We must be home before vespers. Merchants arriving with carts of cloth or wine began to time their visits so as not to interrupt the monks' prayers. Even disputes were settled by the bell. We will meet again at nones, when the monks have finished their prayers. Soon, village life bent gently toward monastic rhythm. Weddings were arranged after the midday prayer, funerals aligned with vespers, markets bustled most after lauds. The monastery had not imposed its order. The bell had simply rung long enough that people began to live by its voice. This was the first quiet revolution of time. The hours were no longer private whispers between God and monk. They became a common language binding cloister and countryside. A bell that once summoned only hooded brethren now also told a shepherd when to move his flock, a brewer when to tap his cask, a miller when to start his wheel. Unintentionally, the monks had shared something larger than devotion. They had taught the village to live by measured hours, setting in motion a change that would one day transform kingdoms. The clocks that rose above cities. As towns grew, they too desired what the monasteries had long guarded, order in the passing of hours. No longer content to rely on the faint tolling of a distant abbey bell, merchants and councils sought time for themselves. Markets needed regulation, courts demanded punctuality, and guilds required shared rhythms for labor. So, in the hearts of cities, towers began to rise. At first, they were modest, bearing simple bells that struck at intervals. But soon, mechanical minds, many of them trained as monks, crafted devices that measured the hours with gears, weights, and escapements. In Milan, Florence, and Paris, such clocks became marvels. Their hands moved across painted faces, not with the imprecision of dripping water or shifting shadows, but with the steady tick of iron and ingenuity. Crowds gathered when the first tower clock struck the hour, their sound rolling through narrow streets, echoing against stone. The bells became civic voices. They told bakers when to open stalls, magistrates when to hear petitions, guards when to lock the gates. In London, it was said the watchmen no longer needed to shout the time, for the great bell told it for them. And with each city clock, the monk's quiet rhythm escaped the cloister entirely. What had once been sacred order became common expectation. People no longer asked, "Is it time?" They asked instead, "What hour is it?" Yet even as cities turned to gears and weights, monasteries remained faithful to their older ways. A brother in Canterbury still watched shadows on the cloister wall, while in Cluny a monk still lit candles to mark the hours of night. The old methods lingered, even as the world outside rushed to embrace precision. The paradox was gentle but profound. Monks had taught the world the value of hours, and then the world, eager for them, built machines to count them even better than monks could. The monks who resisted the clock. When the first great tower clocks began to strike over cities, not all monks rejoiced. For some, the sound was unsettling, not because it was loud, but because it was unceasing. Bells that once belonged to God's rhythm were now claimed by markets, councils, and townsfolk with no vows of silence. In one abbey near Cologne, Brother Matthias wrote bitterly in his journal, "The city has a bell that chimes the hours as if heaven itself were a merchant's ledger. Men now rise not for God, but for trade." To men like Matthias, the clock was not an instrument of devotion but of intrusion. It stole the mystery of time. Shadows on the sundial and the soft drip of water were gentle, almost living, signs that time belonged to God. But iron gears and mechanical teeth made time sharp, exact, unyielding. And yet not all monks agreed. Some saw the machines as marvels. In Paris, Dominican friars welcomed clockmakers into their cloisters, offering them scraps of parchment and advice from their own careful records of hours. "Is not all order holy?" one friar remarked. "And if a bell can help a cobbler know when to rest his hands, does he not also serve God by keeping his strength?" The debate spread quietly through cloisters. Was precision a gift or a burden? Did God require perfect hours, or only faithful hearts? Some monasteries clung to their hourglasses, sundials, and dripping water clocks, refusing to let mechanical noise drown out prayer. Others embraced the new inventions, installing smaller versions within their own walls, marveling as brass weights replaced dripping jars of water. But one truth was clear: the world beyond cloisters was no longer waiting for monks to measure time. Time had escaped, and it now walked the streets, rang in markets, and perched above towers, counting for all who would listen. When time grew restless. Before the clocks rang in city squares, life moved with the seasons, with light and dark, with harvest and hunger. A villager did not wake because it was 6, but because the rooster crowed. A baker pulled bread when it was golden, not when an iron hand said it must be done. But when tower bells struck the hours, something shifted. The pace of life grew more restless. Merchants began to measure how long an apprentice worked. Guilds set strict hours for labor and for rest. Market days were timed to the striking of bells rather than the waxing of light. At first, people marveled. Time had never been so clear, so certain. But with clarity came pressure. A craftsman who lingered over his task could no longer shrug and say, "The sun was slow today." Now the bell proved him wrong. For the monks, who had once been the guardians of sacred rhythm, this was a strange sight. Their bells had always rung for prayer, not for profit. And though their schedules were strict, they had never measured life to the minute. The psalms themselves ebbed and flowed with breath, sometimes lasting longer, sometimes shorter, depending on the voices that sang them. Brother Alfric, an English monk, wrote in wonder and unease, "The city counts hours like coins. They stack them neatly, one upon another, as if they can be kept. But time is not a purse to be filled. It is a river." And yet the bells did not stop. Their rhythm carried into homes, fields, and courts of law. What was once divine became civic, and what was once fluid became fixed. In this way, the monks saw a world they had helped to shape begin to slip from their fingers. They had taught men to honor the hours, and now men demanded hours in greater detail than monks themselves had ever dreamed. God's time versus merchant's time. In the cloister, time had always been circular. Morning prayers rose like dawn, evening psalms faded like dusk, and the seasons cycled through planting and harvest, fasting and feasting. To a monk, eternity was not a straight road but a wheel turning, always leading back to God. But in the marketplace, time began to harden into something else, a line, measured and divided. Each hour became a block, each block a unit of labor, each unit of labor a measure of profit. What was once sacred rhythm became an account ledger. Monks called this merchants' time. Not because they despised merchants, for monasteries themselves brewed ale, baked bread, and kept vineyards, but because they felt that something in the soul of time had shifted. God's time was forgiving. If a prayer was late because the sun was hidden, or if a vigil stretched longer because the chanting was sweet, it was no sin. But merchants' time was merciless. An hour was an hour, and lateness meant loss. Some abbots grew uneasy when they heard townsfolk using the abbey's own bells as signals for trade. A bell meant to summon monks to prayer might send a miller rushing to close a deal. A prayer to God became a timer for wheat. One chronicler in Bruges wrote with sorrow, "Once the sound of bells lifted hearts to heaven. Now men curse them if they ring too late for the market." And so the paradox deepened. Monks had been the keepers of hours, the masters of rhythm, yet by teaching the world to honor time, they had unleashed a hunger for precision they could not contain. The cloister still rang with psalms, still marked the rise and fall of day, but beyond its walls the hours no longer belonged to God alone. They had become a currency in which all must trade. When silence met the clock. For centuries, A monk's greatest wealth was silence. In the stillness between bells, in the pauses between chants, in the long breath before dawn prayer, they found God. Silence was not emptiness, it was fullness, a vessel into which the divine could pour. But as mechanical clocks spread, silence grew thinner. Bells rang more often, not just for matins or vespers, but for every passing hour. The sound that once pulled men upward toward heaven now pressed them forward through their day. Brother Hugo of Paris, writing in the 14th century, confessed, "The clock cuts the hours too small. When I pray, I feel the bell behind me, urging me on. I finish my psalm not because I have lifted it fully to God, but because the iron tongue will soon speak again." In some monasteries, debates broke out. Should the new clocks rule the rhythm of prayer, or should prayer remain larger, unmeasured by wheels and weights? Some abbots embraced the precision, saying it was a gift of order, a way to prevent slackness. Others resisted, warning that devotion was not a matter of minutes, but of heart. Imagine the cloister garden, once a place of timeless stillness. Bees hummed among herbs, and monks tended lavender or thyme, their movements steady, unrushed. Now, a bell might cut across the quiet at every hour, slicing silence into smaller and smaller fragments. For monks, this was not only a matter of noise. It was a matter of the soul. Could eternity still be touched in moments measured so tightly? Could prayer still flow when time itself had grown restless? The answer was uncertain. Yet within the walls, many clung to the old rhythm, to God's time, even as beyond the gates, merchants' time grew stronger by the year. The village learns the hours. Outside the monastery walls, the villagers had long lived by the sky. Dawn meant work, dusk meant rest, and the seasons themselves were their great calendar, lambing in spring, shearing in summer, harvest in autumn, firewood and fasting in winter. But as the monastery's bells rang with more precision, the people began to borrow them. The smith in his forge timed the heating of iron by the hour bell instead of the shadows on his floor. The baker pulled loaves from the oven not by smell alone, but by the count of tolls. Children, who once ran home only when the sun dipped low, now rushed back when the bell rang for none. At first, it was convenient. Bells carried across the fields like shepherds' voices. They gave the village a shared heartbeat. A farmer no longer had to squint at the sun, he simply listened. But with convenience came burden. A missed bell might mean late work, missed trade, or suspicion of laziness. Those who once worked by their own pace found themselves bent to an iron rhythm, even if the clock itself was hidden behind the monastery gates. There are records of villagers joking that the monks had chained time, but there was unease beneath the jest. One elderly shepherd near Ghent is said to have muttered, "When the sun tells me to move the flock, I feel it in my bones. When the bell tells me, I feel it in my neck." Slowly, village life shifted. Markets opened and closed with the bell. Contracts were sealed by the hour. Even weddings and funerals grew punctual, for the priest would not tarry beyond the scheduled mass. And so, what began as a tool for prayer in the cloister seeped into cottages and fields, until even the humblest farmer carried invisible hours on his back. Festivals, feasts, and the new tyranny of hours. For centuries, the rhythm of the year had been carried not by hours but by holy days. Villagers did not count weeks so much as they counted feasts: Candlemas in February, Easter in spring, St. John's fires in midsummer, Michaelmas in autumn. Each feast was a pocket of eternity, spilling light into ordinary days. But as bells and clocks multiplied, even festivals began to fracture into hours. Where once a village feast might stretch from dawn until stars, now it was sliced neatly: Mass at the first bell, procession at the second, games at the third, sermons by the hour, and dismissal before sunset. To many, this felt like progress. Order made it possible for large crowds to gather without chaos. processions flowed more smoothly, and markets alongside feast days thrived when buyers and sellers knew exactly how long they had. Yet something was lost. The wildness of time, the way a feast could spill over its edges, blurring into a night of song and wine until no one knew when it began or ended, was slowly pressed into order. The spontaneity of joy became a schedule. Even dreams began to change. Old village tales spoke of timeless wanderings, spirits who led travelers into enchanted forests where a night's dancing lasted 100 years, or saints who prayed so deeply that the sun stood still for them. But newer sermons warned of wasted hours, of souls who let minutes slip into idleness. Eternity, once imagined as a vast meadow of light, was now pictured as an everlasting choir where the saints sang perfectly in time, never a note or beat astray. Rest days, too, grew narrower. In earlier times, Sundays stretched wide, prayers in the morning, then rest, laughter, feasting, and wandering in the afternoon. But as hours grew precious, the church began to police idleness more tightly. Work was forbidden not just vaguely, on Sunday, but from Vespers on Saturday until Vespers on Sunday. The boundaries tightened. Time itself became fenced. And so, eternity, the very gift monks sought to touch in prayer, was being remade into something counted, divided, and measured. The world had entered a new contract with time, and though it glittered with order, it weighed heavily on the shoulders of those who had once lived more freely within its flow. The quiet resistance of monks. Not every monk bowed to the tyranny of the new hours. In small, hidden ways some resisted. Brother Theobald, an old monk at a remote priory in the hills, would shake his head when the younger brothers fussed with the sundial, or wound the abbey's new iron clock. "You can chase the sun with wheels and weights," he muttered, "but you'll never make it stop for you." His hands, wrinkled from decades of gardening, still reached for the soil and the sky rather than the bell rope. For him, the signs of time were not clappers of bronze but the slow turn of being vines, the way the frost melted later each morning as winter waned, the hush of owls that returned like old friends each season. He prayed when the first bird sang at dawn, not when the bell ordered it. He broke fast when the sheep stirred in their pen, not when the abbot's rule demanded it. Others, though quietly, shared his rebellion. In the scriptorium, Brother Anselm would sometimes delay the bell's command, dipping his quill into ink a few breaths longer, finishing a thought, a curve of a letter, before rising. "The word matters more than the hour," he once whispered. In the infirmary, Sister Amicia timed her healing not with the abbey clock but with the rhythms of breath and pulse. She said a man's heartbeat was holier than any brass weight. When challenged, she bowed politely but went on as before. The abbots, aware but silent, tolerated these small acts of defiance. Perhaps they knew that rules could not fully bind the human spirit, nor could bells erase the body's ancient pact with the earth. Time, after all, was God's gift before it was man's measure. And so, even as towns and kings embraced their chiming hours, the cloisters kept a faint murmur of the older ways. Beneath the echo of bells, there remained a gentler rhythm, seasons, stars, the scent of herbs in bloom, the hush of dusk. It was a kind of underground current flowing beneath the surface of ordered hours. Theobald, in his last years, said it best to a novice who worried about missing the bell. "Child, eternity does not ring. It breathes. Listen for that, and you'll never lose the hour that matters. The eternal hour." Night settles differently in a monastery. Not as a sudden curtain, but as a slow gathering of shadows, folding gently over stone and wood. The last bell fades into silence, its echo lingering in the cloister arches like a memory of sound. Brother Anselm once told a young novice that time inside the abbey was not a line but a circle. The novice frowned, for he had been taught that hours marched forward like soldiers. But Anselm pointed to the sky. "See how the stars return? See how the seasons repeat? Even your breath comes and goes. Nothing is lost, only returning. And perhaps that was how monks truly kept time, even beyond bells and sundials. In their prayers, in the rhythm of chant, in the cycle of fasting and feasting, they wove themselves into the same circle the earth had spun since creation. They did not own time, they belonged to it. On certain nights, when the moon cast silver light across the cloister, it was possible to believe that nothing had changed in centuries. The same stones, the same quiet corridors, the same hymns rising in unison. Bells might toll, sundials might mark their shadows, even clocks might tick with mechanical certainty, but beneath it all was a deeper pulse, slow and unbroken. When Brother Theobald passed, they buried him beneath the herb garden he had tended. No bell marked his last breath, no sundial's shadow stood over his grave. Instead, a sparrow sang at the moment the earth was pressed over him. Some said it was coincidence, others said it was grace. But those who heard it never forgot. And so time in the abbey did not end with death. It carried on in chants, in gardens, in the sound of bells that rang into the future. And in quiet hearts, some still remembered the truer hour, the hour that needed no measure, no mark, no count. It was simply the hour of being. The eternal hour.